of John. Jesus said, "I have made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They were yours and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. For the words that you have gave to me I have given to them, and they have received them and know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I have been glorified in them. And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me. I guarded them, and not one of them was lost except the one destined to be lost, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I am coming to you, and I speak these things in the world so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctified myself, so that they also may be sanctified in truth." The word of the Lord. You may be seated.
So in conversations back in seminary where we would debate the merits of preaching through the lectionary versus like through a book of the Bible or through, topical, those very riveting conversations you have when you're in seminary, I, like many people before me, appreciated that I like the way a lectionary forces a preacher to work through texts that they would have otherwise ignored, be that an intentional decision or not. And then this week I realized I always shared that opinion on weeks when I wasn't preaching, which feels now a little naive. But here we are with a text that, if left to my own devices, I absolutely would have glossed over. And in full honesty, I probably could have picked one of the other texts for today, but there was just something about this prayer uttered by Jesus in John 17 that stuck with me. On my most honest of days, I would have to tell you that I don't know exactly what I believe about prayer. Growing up, the only instruction I remember receiving about prayer happened when an ambulance would drive by, sirens blaring, and my mom would urge my younger brothers and I to pray. Someone must have taught me something else about it, because I have vivid memories of lying awake in bed as a child, obsessively running through the name of every single person I knew before finally giving up and praying a blanket prayer for everyone in the world before finally falling asleep. I was, you might be surprised to hear, a very anxious child, and I was worried about what would happen if I would forget someone on my list. I felt like it was my job to convince God to care about that person in the ambulance, about my family and friends, about the world. As I grew older, I learned that, as my childhood pastor liked to say, God wasn't a vending machine, and my prayers weren't some spiritual act of putting in enough quarters to buy a Three Musketeers bar. But I wasn't sure then what the point of interceding was at all. Working in the hospital as an adult made prayer all the more complicated. Day in and day out, I would encounter loving, faithful family members praying for a miracle. I believed that, as the book of James teaches, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective, but I also believed the wisdom and expertise of the medical staff when they said there was nothing further they could do. I saw patients who prayed for healing walk out of the hospital restored, and I saw patients who prayed for healing never walk out at all. I have prayed prayers that have been answered so clearly, there is no doubt in my mind that the circumstances are anything but that, an answered prayer. And I have prayed some prayers for years that seem to receive only silence in response. There have been times in my life where I've clung to prayer like a lifeline, and indeed it truly was. And there have been times when my prayers felt dried up, where I've questioned if they make a difference. I think that something happens when I pray for myself, for the community, and for the world, but I'm not always sure what. So on my most honest of days, I would tell you I don't know exactly what I think or believe about prayer and how it works. But if there is any community in which it is safe to say that, it is this one. I know that my complicated feelings about prayer are likely echoed by some in this room, and if that happens to be you today, welcome. I am glad to be in the mystery with you. And if that is not you today, if prayer feels like something solid and tangible and sure, welcome too. I'm going to lean on your belief, if that's okay. So today we're with Jesus in John 17, and he is praying. John 17 takes place in what is often called the farewell discourse, this section of John that records the last teaching of Christ gave his disciples before being crucified. In chapter 13, Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples and warns them of his upcoming death. He then goes on throughout chapters 13 through 15 to speak to his disciples of all they need to know and be prepared for as they look towards taking on Christ's mission as their own. And chapter 16 serves as kind of a summary of this. Chapter 17 is the end of this discourse, and the entire chapter is a prayer, what scholars often call the high priestly prayer of Jesus. The first 5 verses are Jesus praying for himself, that he might be glorified. Verses 6 to 19, which we're looking at today, include Jesus' prayer for his disciples. Some scholars think this middle section is John's version of the Lord's Prayer, because some of the language and themes echo those in the prayer that Jesus teaches his disciples in Matthew and Luke. The last verses of the chapter, verses 20 to 26, include Christ's prayer for all the future believers. And if you got lost while listening to Dave read the passage earlier this morning, rest assured, you are not alone. John 17 is this text that seems to circle and spiral in on itself. Professor of Biblical Studies Mark G. Vitalis Hoffman comments on this aspect of the text, stating, "It is a passage that functions better as a meditative prayer than as a spoken text." Whoops. It's like, he continues saying, it's like a fabric woven with repeating words and themes. And so as we jump into some of those specifics of the prayer today, we're going to focus in on some of the words and themes and what they teach us about the prayer's tapestry as a whole, rather than trying to unravel each individual thread. In verse 6, Jesus talks about how he has revealed God to those whom God gave him. These people know now, Jesus says, that everything Christ has was given by God, that Jesus is from God, sent by God. He utters, "I pray for them. I am not praying for the world, but for those whom you have given me, for they are yours." This theme in particular of the world will come up again and again in this passage. In verse 6, in verse 9, in 11, in 14, 15, 16, 18. Some Christians and scholars over the years have tried to figure out who the people whom you have been sent to Jesus and who the world is. They've drawn stark lines around these categories. Those whom have been sent to Jesus, these scholars suppose, are the Christians, and the world is everything else and everyone else outside that fold. But as we know all too well, there is danger in creating boundaries around who is in and who is out, because these human-made standards almost always cause harm. And as the book of John's perhaps most famous verse, 3:16, tells us, God so loved the world, the whole world, not just the ones sent to Jesus. In Greek, the word for world, cosmos, has several translations. It can mean the world or universe, like the planet. It can mean the people of the world, or it can also mean that which is opposed to God and are, as one definition said, hostile to the cause of Christ. Many commentators think that John 17 is leaning into this last definition, and I'm inclined to agree. In this interpretation, the world refers to the powers, be they religious or political or social, that don't align with the kingdom Christ invites us into. These forces and powers are institutions like racism, capitalism, homophobia, sexism, ableism that call us towards a world of division, that seek to grow power for those at the top while exploiting those with less. And I appreciate this definition because I think it brings nuance to our understanding of the world we're in. Too often in evangelical Christianity, it is easy to interpret our world in light of Genesis 3 and think of it all as fallen and bad, forgetting the truth proclaimed in Genesis 1 that it was created to be good. Instead, I like the definition that Susan Hidal has used for the world in John 17, stating that it is not a place antithetical to the goodness of creation, but rather it is the persons and forces opposed or indifferent to the things of God embodied in Jesus. So much of our passage this morning is about the relationships of the disciples, of us, to that world. Jesus is leaving the world, he says in this text. He's going to the Father, but the disciples will continue to be in the world. They do not belong to the world, but they are sent into it. The idea of being in the world, but not of the world, is one that rolled around the evangelical circles of my youth a lot. It created this sense of separation. It gave me a feeling of moral superiority from those around me. It was the reason I didn't go to any of the cool parties growing up. Well, that and I never got invited to them anyways, probably because I gave off an air of moral superiority. But what if, when Jesus is saying that the disciples no longer belong to the world, he's speaking in regards to these forces and institutions of division? Jesus spent his time on earth ushering in a kingdom that looked vastly different from the one the disciples lived in. In Jesus' world, the last are first, the poor are fed, the sick find healing, the prisoner released, the person on the outskirts is drawn into the center. There is no place in Christ's kingdom for those forces that seek to divide and dismantle and harm, for powers that profit off of the exploitation of others. It is this world to which people who seek to follow Jesus can no longer belong. And yet that is the world that the disciples, the world that we swim in. So how do you do that without drowning? Much of Jesus' prayer here in John 17 seems to revolve around a longing and a desire for his disciples to live well in the world as folks who have been made different through their relationship with him. So he makes three primary requests in this prayer, and the first two are related to protection. First, he prays in verse 11 that God would protect the disciples for the sake of unity. Protect them in your name, Jesus prays, so that they may be one as we are one. In verses 21 through 23, which are not included in our lectionary text, Jesus will expound upon this idea, asking that the people would be one with Father, Son, and each other, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. In verse 17, Jesus will ask for protection again a second time, this time asking that the disciples be protected from the evil one, who O'Day and Hyland define as the embodiment of all that is opposed to God. So the point of the protection that Jesus is praying for, as scholar Meta Stamper points out, is for the people to experience the love that comes from being in oneness with Father and Son, so that this love might be shared with the world. Christ prays for oneness and unity not in a surface level sense where all appear the same, but rather unity in action and goal to show love. We are in the world, Jesus proclaims, a world that has its troubles. And so he asks that we might be protected from the evil one, that we would not succumb to those forces of discord and division, but instead meet them with love. As Stamper continues, Jesus' own are to be protected not only for their own states, but also in order to fulfill the mission of love in the world. Historically, the Christian church has not always been the best at living into this prayer of Jesus's. We've often let the illusion of unity, of false unity, cause us to silence the voices of those who are different. Queer folks and BIPOC individuals and women and the disabled and the poor, and basically anyone who did not fit whatever was the current mold of obedience and belief. Rather than offer love to those around us, rather than change as an outpouring of that love, the Church Catholic has too often sacrificed them to our idols of consensus and contentment, feeding into the very forces of division in the world that we are called to be set apart from. We need to continue to seek repentance and reparation for this. And acknowledging this truth, it is also true that there have been times in which the church has lived well into this call, the call to be united in the world in a way that shows God's love. I think of churches coming together to drive out hate messages at the Pride Parade. I think of the way faith communities often respond generously and without discrimination during times of natural disaster. I think even of our own city and the group of people from a wide range of religious backgrounds who gathered together at Montrose Beach in March on a pilgrimage prayer walk for ceasefire in Gaza. This is the way we are called to be in the world, united in love. In the final verses of our lectionary text, Christ makes a third request, that the disciples would be sanctified in God's truth. Sanctification is the process of being made holy, and it often comes with the connotation of being purified and set apart from God, or for God. But in the context of this text, sanctification is not about being taken away from, but rather a way of being immersed in the world. Jesus wants the disciples to be made holy, that they might bring God's love into the world too. As Claudio Carvajales, professor of worship at Union Theological Seminary, puts it, Jesus called us into sanctification, which is the becoming of who we and the earth are in God. Sacred people living in sacred places with all forms of sacred life without distinction. This then seems to me to be what Jesus is saying in this prayer. Those that know Christ are sent to be love in a world that often pursues love's exact opposite. And this will be hard, so protect them, God. Sanctify them. And do this, Jesus says, so that they might know joy. In verse 13, Jesus states that I speak these things into the world so that they may have my joy made complete in themselves. Our contemporary understanding of joy is one of profound glee, like when you're really happy, but that's not exactly how the original recipients of the text would have understood it. One book that I read stated that in Greco-Roman antiquity, emotions generally were understood as irrational impulses to be controlled by a rational person, and I felt called out by that as a very emotional person. But in their understanding, joy was related to the habits and behaviors that contribute to human flourishing. Joy was not a state in which suffering didn't happen, but rather the state of living into Christ's now and not yet kingdom. Jesus' prayer in this text is to God, it's on behalf of the disciples, and it's spoken in their hearing. He's reminding the listener that part of how we flourish is by showing Christ's love in the world. So what does that mean for us today? Sometimes I think about writing acknowledgments for my sermons the way that authors write them at the end of their books, or to shout out my unofficial sponsors like they do on public television. This week's sermon has most definitely been brought to you by Diet Coke, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice soundtrack, and Christopher Tin's choral album, The Drop That Contained the Sea. But it's also been brought to you by my social media feed. This week, I have scrolled through countless posts about the Met Gala. followed immediately by coverage of the ongoing genocide in Rafah and Gaza. I have watched videos of Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, complete with comments from strangers about how unfair it is that she changed the set list, followed by someone's request for prayer for their medically complicated child, and for another person sharing about the training he was going through to better serve unhoused folks. Scrolling this week has felt like a little microcosm of trying to navigate being in the world and all the directions it pulls. Don't get me wrong, I love beauty, I celebrate art, I love the detail of a Met Gala's fashion, and I watched all those Eras Tour videos. But it also, as many astute social commentators have noted this week, it felt a little bit like living in the Hunger Games, where these grand events celebrating capitalism drew attention away from legitimate injustice and human rights atrocities going on in the Middle East. It has been a bit overwhelming, personally. It has been hard to know what to do, and I can feel paralyzed and tend toward apathy. But I think the call of John 17 is to go out into a world full of the forces of injustice and oppression and act with love. So we show up at the protest, or we offer hugs at the Pride Parade, or we build community with our warming center guests. And even before that, I think one call of John 17 is to start with prayer. When I started working on this passage, the first commentary I read was by Veronis Miles, the professor of preaching and director of African American Church Studies at Wesley Theological Seminary. For Miles, the power of this text is not found in the particularity of each verse, but in the overall act itself, that Jesus prays for his disciples. She writes, "The power and necessity of intercessory prayer immediately sprang to mind when I read John 17. Intercession is an expression of agapic love. And so," Miles continues, "my heart is flooded with gratitude that Jesus, God's righteous servant, loves us so much that he interceded on our behalf, even when death loomed large before him. This is good news." One year when I was in college, I returned to my hometown for a break, and I ran into my high school English teacher. And she started telling me about this tree in a nearby park that had begun to bloom. It turned out that she had a list of people she prayed for every morning on her drive into work, and somehow I'd been on that list for years. And so every day she'd pray for the people in the exact same order, and every day she'd start praying for me as she drove past this tree, thinking of me as it bloomed, as the leaves flourished, as they fell in the autumn, as it went barren in the winter and started all over again. I don't have any idea what she prayed for over those years. I don't know what the outcomes of her prayers were. But I think about the generosity of that act, the way it spoke of her love for the people on that list, her love for me, her trust that her prayer meant something. And I'm moved by the gift. In the end, John 17 doesn't resolve any of my ongoing questions regarding prayer. I've spent the week reading commentaries about Christ's high priestly prayer while simultaneously wondering if my prayers do anything when genocide looms large. But what I came to see was that part of the good news of this text today is that regardless of how I might feel about prayer on any given day, in John 17, Jesus sees value in interceding for his believers. He did so as an act of love, trusting that God listened. To be so loved by Christ that he prays for us is such a gift. And as such, I wonder if the call for all of us this morning is to do just that, to intercede for others as an act of love too. I'm so grateful that our community continues to do this so intentionally, to make space on Sunday mornings to speak aloud how we can pray for each other and to intercede on one another's behalf. I hope this passage encourages us to continue doing this, to boldly intercede for the things that are going on in our own lives and in the world. It is an act of hope and trust to act for prayer, and it is an act of love to pray. And it is meaningful to me on the days when I'm not sure that my prayers matter, to lean on the belief of others in this room who trust that they do. Jesus prays in John 17, and immediately after he finishes, he leaves to go to the garden where Judas would betray him and he would be arrested. He knew crucifixion was coming. He knew this would be his last night with his disciples in the way that they were used to being together. He knows that this is farewell. And in John, he chooses to end his time with them with this prayer. When faced with his coming torture and death, Jesus trusted that the best thing he could do for his disciples in that moment was to pray for them. He believed that it meant something and made a difference. And so I hope that we, as people sent out into this world to show love, might start by showing love through our prayer too. Thanks be to God. Amen.